Think the Wild West was all about the Colt Peacemaker and a few famous six-shooters you've heard 1,000 times? Think again. Behind the legends were revolvers that never made it into Hollywood westerns, dime novels, or flashy museum displays. Revolvers so rare, so unusual, and sometimes so downright strange that they've been almost completely forgotten, despite the fact that real outlaws, lawmen, gamblers, and settlers once trusted their lives to them. Today, we're digging deep into the hidden corners of firearms history to reveal the 15 rarest revolvers of the Wild West. These weren't always the fastest or the deadliest, but they tell a side of frontier life you've never seen before. From bizarre double-trigger designs to pocket-sized pistols you could hide up your sleeve, to outlaw favorites that competed directly with Colt for dominance. This isn't the Wild West, you know. It's the Weird West. And once you see what made these forgotten revolvers so unique, you'll never look at frontier gunfighting the same way again. So, saddle up, because some of these revolvers will absolutely shatter everything you thought you knew about the Old West. If you love uncovering hidden history and frontier myths, hit that like button. It helps us keep these rare stories alive. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our deep dives into the Wild West's most dangerous legends. Number 15. The Colt Paterson, the beginning of it all. Before the Peacemaker, before the Navy, and before Colt became a household name, there was the revolver that started it all. The Colt Paterson of 1836. This was Samuel Colt's very first revolver design, and while it looked elegant and almost delicate compared to the heavy-duty six-shooters that followed, it was nothing short of revolutionary for its time. Imagine a frontier world where most people were still fumbling with single-shot pistols or cumbersome rifles. Then along comes a firearm that suddenly gave you 5 shots in a row without reloading. On the early American frontier, that was the difference between survival and a shallow grave. The Paterson was chambered in smaller calibers, usually .28 or .36, and had to be reloaded by partially disassembling the gun, making it slow and awkward by later standards. But that didn't matter. Texas Rangers adopted it almost immediately, and it quickly gained a fearsome reputation in skirmishes against both Mexican forces and Comanche warriors. A single Ranger with a brace of Patersons could unleash 10 rounds in rapid succession, an unheard-of advantage in the 1830s and 40s. Yet the Paterson was far from perfect. Its delicate mechanics were prone to failure, and the reloading process was so fiddly that many shooters simply carried multiple revolvers instead of trying to reload under pressure. Colt's young company even went bankrupt after early sales struggled. But history would prove the Paterson's impact undeniable. It laid the groundwork for every Colt that followed, from the Walker to the legendary Peacemaker. In short, the Colt Paterson wasn't just a revolver. It was the spark that ignited the entire era of repeating handguns. But while Colt was focused on simple elegance, the next design on our list went in the opposite direction. Number 14, the Savage Navy, 1861, the double-trigger oddity. Imagine holding a revolver that looks familiar at first glance, until you notice something bizarre. It has 2 triggers. That was the Savage Navy revolver, patented in 1861, one of the strangest firearms ever to drift onto the American frontier. Instead of cocking the hammer with your thumb like every other revolver of its era, the Savage had a second trigger built directly under the first. The shooter would pull the lower cocking trigger to rotate the cylinder and cock the hammer, and then squeeze the upper trigger to fire. In theory, this gave the gun the speed of a double-action design, without actually being double-action. On paper, it looked like a brilliant idea. In practice, not so much. The design was heavy, awkward, and clunky in the hand. The Savage Navy weighed nearly 4 pounds and had a bulky, oversized frame that made it hard to handle compared to sleek Colts or Remingtons. While a Colt Navy 1851 pointed naturally like an extension of the arm, the Savage felt more like a clumsy contraption. Imagine fumbling with 2 triggers while your opponent needed just 1. Not exactly the edge you want in a gunfight. Soldiers who carried it during the Civil War often complained it was slow and unreliable, and after the war, only a trickle of them ever made it west. A few settlers bought them up as cheap surplus, but most frontiersmen stuck with the tried-and-true single-trigger designs. Would you have been willing to train yourself on such an awkward system? Or would you have ditched it for a Colt? The shocking truth? Despite all that strange innovation, the Savage Navy was widely considered a failure in its own time. It promised to revolutionize revolver technology, but instead it became a historical footnote, remembered more for its bizarre appearance than its performance. Number 13. The Starr double action in 1858 to 1863, the clumsy pioneer. Long before the sleek Colt Lightning or modern double-action revolvers, there was an ungainly giant that tried to bring rapid firepower to the battlefield, the Starr double-action revolver. First issued in 1858, the Starr was one of the earliest American double-action designs, meaning you could fire it simply by pulling the trigger instead of thumbing back the hammer every time. On paper, this gave soldiers a huge edge in speed. In reality, the Starr was bulky, awkward, and had a trigger pull so heavy it felt more like squeezing a set of pliers than firing a gun. Still, the US government bought tens of thousands of them during the Civil War, arming cavalry units who needed firepower on horseback. And a fair number of these revolvers made their way westward after the war. At first glance, they seemed like competitors to Colt and Remington, but side by side, the differences were impossible to ignore. While a Colt balanced naturally in the hand, the Starr looked oversized and clumsy, a brute of a gun in a world that was moving towards sleek precision. Frontiersmen who ended up with one often saw it as a mixed blessing. Yes, you could dump shots faster than your opponent, but hitting anything with that crushing trigger pull was another matter. Gunfighters who prized accuracy tended to sneer at it, while soldiers who used them in the field were quick to pawn them off once better revolvers became available. Yet despite its clumsy execution, the Starr deserves credit. It was a bold attempt at innovation, a stepping stone that helped push revolver design toward the double-action future. Without awkward pioneers like the Starr, later icons like the Colt Lightning might never have existed. Today, surviving Starr revolvers are much rarer on the collector's market than Colts, partly because so many were scrapped or discarded. So here's the question. If you were on the frontier and had to choose, would you take the speed of the Starr or stick with the smooth accuracy of a Colt? Number 12. The Colt Root Sidehammer, the Sidewinder. When most people think of Colt revolvers, they picture massive horse pistols or the rugged Peacemaker. But in the 1850s, Colt experimented with something entirely different. A sleek little pocket revolver designed for everyday carry, the Colt Root Sidehammer. Named after Colt's superintendent Elisha K. Root, this revolver broke almost every design convention of its time. Instead of a top strap or open frame like most Colts, the Root used a solid frame with a distinctive side-mounted hammer, giving it a profile unlike anything else in the era. Chambered in small calibers like .28 and .31, it wasn't built for duels or battlefields. It was built for shopkeepers, gamblers, and townsfolk who wanted a last-ditch weapon they could slip into a pocket. In terms of innovation, the Root was way ahead of its time. Its solid frame design would later become the industry standard, improving strength and reliability. It also offered surprisingly good accuracy for such a small revolver, thanks to Colt's precision machining. But it wasn't without issues. The small calibers lacked stopping power, and the unusual sidehammer placement could make it awkward for shooters used to traditional designs. Side by side with a massive Dragoon or a Navy Colt, the Root almost looked like a toy, but that was part of its appeal. It was light, concealable, and practical in a way the battlefield revolvers never could be. For everyday folks who couldn't afford a big Colt or didn't need one, the Root was a smart option. Here's the myth-busting detail. Despite Hollywood's obsession with showing every cowboy carrying giant six-shooters, many frontier people actually relied on small pocket revolvers like the Root. The truth is, the Wild West wasn't only about big guns and fast draws. It was often about carrying something small, concealable, and just good enough to get you home alive. Number 11. Moore's Patent Revolver, the Pocket Protector. Not every revolver on the frontier was a hulking .44 meant for duels or cavalry charges. Some of the most common and surprisingly effective guns were the ones you could fit in your vest pocket. And that one of the most influential of these was the Moore's Patent Revolver. First produced in the late 1850s by Daniel Moore, this was one of the earliest revolvers designed specifically to fire self-contained metallic cartridges, long before they became the industry standard. Chambered in .32 rimfire, the Moore revolver had a petite 5-shot cylinder and a compact frame that made it perfect for shopkeepers, gamblers, or anyone who wanted a weapon they could discreetly carry in a pocket or up a sleeve. Its most distinctive feature was the side-hinged barrel. To reload, the shooter flipped the barrel to the side, popped out the empties with an ejector rod, and slipped in fresh cartridges. Compared to clunky cap and ball reloads, it was a revelation. Quick, simple, and effective. Exactly what you'd want if trouble broke out in a saloon or a back alley. Of course, it wasn't without flaws. The small .32 rimfire round lacked serious stopping power, and the revolver's light frame wasn't built for heavy abuse. A Colt Navy could still outshoot it in range, accuracy, and punch. But here's the truth most people forget. In close quarters encounters, which is where most real gunfights actually happened, the Moore revolver could be just as deadly. In fact, more people were likely shot with little pocket pistols like this in barroom brawls and gambling hall disputes than with massive horse pistols like the Dragoon. So why does it matter today? Because the Moore's patent revolver was a pioneer. Its metallic cartridge design directly influenced Smith & Wesson's early pocket revolvers, and it helped set the stage for the future of repeating handguns. And here's the kicker. Surviving examples are now incredibly valuable. A revolver that once fit quietly in a gambler's vest pocket can fetch tens of thousands of dollars at auction today. Number 10. The Remington Rider Pocket Revolver. The gambler's friend. If there was one place in the Wild West where a revolver was guaranteed to be close at hand, it was the gambling table. And while lawmen and outlaws loved their big Colts and Remington armies, the men who spent their nights in smoke-filled saloons often preferred something smaller, quicker, and easier to conceal. Enter the Remington Rider Pocket Revolver. Introduced in the 1860s, the Rider was one of Remington's most popular small-frame percussion revolvers. It was chambered in .31 caliber, making it light and easy to carry, but still deadly enough at the close ranges where most gambling hall disputes turned violent. With a 5-shot cylinder and a streamlined frame, it could slip into a coat pocket or disappear beneath a gambler's waistcoat without raising suspicion. Side by side with a Colt Navy, the Rider looked almost miniature, but that was exactly its strength. In a crowded saloon, the man who could discreetly draw a small revolver often had the edge over someone fumbling with a heavy holster piece. And history shows it. More shootouts probably started with pocket pistols like this in gambling halls and barroom brawls than with massive Dragoons or Walkers. The Rider was also affordable compared to larger service revolvers, which made it attractive to shopkeepers, travelers, and anyone who wanted personal protection without breaking the bank. Its compact size made it fast to draw in tight quarters, and while it lacked the brute power of a .44 Dragoon, it was perfectly suited to the messy, close-range shootouts that were far more common than the staged duels Hollywood loves to show. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The small caliber meant you had to place your shots carefully, and the percussion system still required careful loading compared to later cartridge designs. But for the average citizen or the professional gambler who wanted an ace up his sleeve, sometimes literally, the Rider was the right tool for the job. And here's where the story gets interesting. While pocket revolvers like the Rider thrived in saloons and back alleys, another revolver was rising in popularity among working-class settlers who wanted something bigger, sturdier, and still affordable. It would soon become known as the working man's Colt. Number 9. The Whitney Navy Revolver, the working man's Colt. When Samuel Colt's early patents expired in the 1850s, other gunmakers rushed to fill the gap. One of the boldest challengers was the Whitney Arms Company, and their answer to Colt's dominance was the Whitney Navy Revolver. At first glance, it looked a lot like a Colt Navy 1851. 6 shots, .36 caliber, and a familiar open-frame design. But the Whitney came with one huge difference. It was cheaper. For settlers, shopkeepers, and working-class men who couldn't afford a Colt, the Whitney Navy became the revolver of choice. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't a status symbol, but it was practical and dependable enough to survive life on the frontier. The Whitney Navy saw real action in the Civil War, carried by both Union troops and state militias. After the war, it filtered westward into the hands of pioneers, ranchers, and small-town lawmen. It didn't have the prestige of a Colt, but in many cases, it did the same job for half the cost. Contemporary accounts often mentioned settlers who carried a Whitney simply because that's what was available in the local general store. Mechanically, the Whitney was solid. It was easy to service, parts were interchangeable, and it handled well for its price. Sure, it lacked the fine machining and polish of Colt revolvers, and accuracy could vary, but most users considered it good enough. And here's the twist. While history remembers the Colt Navy as the archetypal mid-century revolver, far more Whitney Navies were actually manufactured, over 100,000 compared to Colt's smaller runs. That means for many working-class Americans, the everyman's sidearm wasn't a Colt at all. It was a Whitney. Ironically, despite being more common back then, fewer Whitneys survive today because so many were simply worn out through daily use. So what about you? If you were on the frontier, would you have paid extra for the prestige of a Colt or saved your money and gone Whitney? Number 8. The Joslyn Revolver, the forgotten cavalry arm. Some revolvers became legends of the frontier. Others slipped quietly into obscurity. The The Joslyn Revolver belongs to the second group, a gun that saw real service but is barely remembered today. Developed in the early 1860s, the Joslyn was a .44 caliber, 6-shot percussion revolver with a solid, sturdy frame. At a glance, it looked like a cross between a Colt and a Remington, but it had its own quirks. The US government purchased around 3,000 Joslyns for cavalry use during the Civil War. But production never scaled up the way it did for Colts or Starrs. That tiny number meant the revolver was already rare before the war even ended. When surplus guns trickled west after 1865, a few made it into the hands of settlers, lawmen, and frontiersmen. In terms of performance, the Joslyn was respectable, rugged, accurate, and powerful enough for close combat. But it never gained the reputation of the Colt Army or Remington New Model. With so few produced, it just couldn't compete in numbers. Still, those who did carry a Joslyn often swore by it. Its solid construction gave it a reputation for durability, and it could handle the rough conditions of cavalry service and frontier life. But while Colt and Remington became household names, Joslyn slipped into the background, a footnote in firearms history. Here's the legacy twist. Surviving Joslyns are among the hardest Civil War revolvers to find on the collector's market today, precisely because there were so few to begin with. If Joslyn had produced tens of thousands instead of a few thousand, it might have been remembered as one of the greats. So here's the question. If you were a cavalryman riding into the chaos of the 1860s, would you have trusted your life to a rare Joslyn, or stuck with the proven reliability of a Colt Army? Number 7. The Forehand and Wadsworth Revolver, the everyman's gun. When we picture the Wild West, we tend to imagine every cowboy strapping on a shiny Colt Peacemaker or a big Remington Army. But here's the truth. Most frontier folks couldn't afford those high-end revolvers. Instead, thousands of settlers relied on cheaper, mass-produced sidearms, and one of the biggest names in that market was Forehand and Wadsworth. Founded in the 1870s in Worcester, Massachusetts, Forehand and Wadsworth churned out revolvers designed for one thing: affordability. Their small frame .32 and .38 caliber double-action revolvers were sold in hardware stores, general stores, and even by mail order. These weren't the guns of famous outlaws or legendary lawmen. They were the guns of shopkeepers, farmers, miners, and everyday settlers who just needed something for protection. The company's revolvers weren't glamorous. They were simple, inexpensive, and often called suicide specials by firearms snobs of the era. But that nickname was more about elitism than truth. While they didn't match the quality of Colts or Smith & Wessons, most Forehand and Wadsworth revolvers were reliable enough at close range, and they were far better than carrying nothing at all. What really set them apart was price. While a Colt Peacemaker might cost the equivalent of a month's wages for a working man, a Forehand revolver could be had for pocket change. That made them accessible to people who otherwise couldn't afford to arm themselves. And on the frontier, that could mean the difference between life and death. Here's the legacy twist. Ironically, these cheap everyman's guns, once dismissed as junk, are now prized by collectors. Because they were used so hard and so often discarded, finding a Forehand and Wadsworth in good condition today is far rarer than finding a Colt. And here's the myth-busting detail. Despite what Hollywood shows, not every man on the frontier carried a Peacemaker. In reality, the majority of revolvers in circulation were inexpensive working man's guns like the ones made by Forehand and Wadsworth. The Wild West wasn't just built on famous Colts. It was also shaped by the humble, everyday revolvers that kept regular people alive. And if you want more myth-busting stories about the real Wild West, not the Hollywood version, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss them. Number 6. The British Bulldog Revolver, the Bulldog Bite. Not every revolver carried on the frontier was American-made. In fact, one of the most popular pocket pistols of the late 19th century came from across the Atlantic, the British Bulldog. Introduced in the 1870s by Philip Webley and Son in Birmingham, England, the Bulldog was a compact double-action revolver chambered in .442 or .450 caliber. Despite its small size, it packed a serious punch, earning its nickname for delivering a powerful bite at close range. With a stubby 2.5-inch barrel and a solid, chunky frame, it wasn't built for long-distance accuracy. This was a close-quarters weapon through and through, perfect for self-defense in the tight alleys of London, or the equally rough-and-tumble saloons of Dodge City. Side by side with the Colt Peacemaker, the Bulldog looked almost squat and stubby, but up close, it hit just as hard. What made it especially influential was how widely it spread. tens of thousands were exported to America, where they became a favorite among shopkeepers, travelers, and anyone who wanted a reliable defensive weapon without lugging around a full-sized revolver. Even President James Garfield's assassin carried a British Bulldog, a grim testament to its power and accessibility. The design was so successful that countless American companies began producing cheap knockoffs. Many of them sold through mail-order catalogs for just a few dollars. Imagine flipping through a catalog in the 1870s and ordering a revolver the way we might order shoes today. The idea that you could buy a gun through the mail would shock us now, but back then it was perfectly normal. And here's the legacy. Original Webley-made Bulldogs are now highly sought after by collectors, while the knockoffs are often curiosities with little value. The irony is that a revolver once seen as a cheap, practical pocket gun is now worth a small fortune in good condition. Proof that sometimes the most unassuming firearms leave the biggest mark on history. Number 5. Allen & Wheelock Revolvers, the cartridge experimenters. While Colt and Remington were perfecting the classic percussion revolver, another Massachusetts company was quietly experimenting with something far more radical: self-contained metallic cartridges. The firm was Allen & Wheelock, and their revolvers represent some of the earliest steps toward the cartridge firearms that would dominate the late 19th century. Allen & Wheelock produced a wide range of revolvers in the 1850s and 60s, from tiny pocket pistols to larger .44 caliber belt revolvers. What made them unique was their attempt to move beyond messy powder and percussion caps. Instead, many Allen & Wheelock designs fired metallic cartridges, an idea that seemed almost futuristic at the time. For civilians, this was revolutionary. No more fiddling with powder flasks and caps under pressure. Instead, you just slipped in a cartridge, cocked the hammer, and fired. Their rimfire models in particular gave settlers and townsfolk a simpler, more reliable way to defend themselves, and they became an early rival to Smith & Wesson in the cartridge game. Here's the myth-busting truth. Most people assume cartridge revolvers began with Smith & Wesson, but Allen & Wheelock were already producing them years earlier. They were innovators, but they ran headlong into a problem: patents. Smith & Wesson held key rights to metallic cartridge technology, and Allen & Wheelock ended up locked in legal battles that crippled their ability to compete. As a result, production numbers stayed low and their revolvers never reached the widespread fame of Colts or Remingtons. Today, that limited production makes them extremely scarce on the collector's market. An Allen & Wheelock revolver in good condition is far rarer than most contemporary Colts, and for serious firearms historians, they represent a forgotten chapter in the cartridge revolution. And speaking of the West, while Allen & Wheelock were pushing technology forward, another company was building one of the last great frontier revolvers, a gun that would become known as the Remington 1890. Number 4. The Remington 1890, the frontier's last stand. By the late 1880s, the Wild West was changing. Railroads stretched across the plains, towns grew into cities, and the old days of buffalo hunts and open-range gunfights were fading fast. But Remington wasn't ready to give up the revolver race just yet. Their answer was the Remington Model 1890, one of the last great six-shooters of the frontier era. At first glance, the 1890 looked familiar. A solid-frame, single-action revolver chambered in .44-40, the same round used in Winchester rifles. That ammo compatibility made it practical for cowboys and lawmen alike. Its design was heavily influenced by Remington's earlier 1875, but with sleeker lines and improvements that made it a direct competitor to Colt's legendary Peacemaker. The 1890 was rugged, accurate, and well-balanced. Shooters praised its durability and the convenience of sharing ammunition with their rifles. For men still riding the range or working as lawmen on the last edges of the frontier, it seemed like the perfect revolver, but here's the problem. It arrived too late. By 1890, the Colt single-action army had already cemented itself as the iconic revolver of the American West. Side by side, the two looked nearly identical, but reputation was everything, and Colt already owned it. Remington's late entry just couldn't break Colt's dominance. Only about 2,000 of the Model 1890 were ever made, a fraction compared to Colt's massive production runs. And here's the twist. Despite being technically excellent, the Remington 1890 became a symbol of missed opportunity. It wasn't remembered as the gun that won the West. It was remembered as the revolver that came at the very end of it. Today, because so few were ever built, surviving examples are among the rarest and most expensive of all frontier revolvers, commanding sky-high prices at auction. Number 3. The Remington 1875, the Colt Challenger. If there was ever a revolver that came closest to stealing Colt's crown, it was the Remington Model 1875. Built during the golden age of the Peacemaker, the 1875 was Remington's bold attempt to go head-to-head with Colt. and for a time it very nearly succeeded. Introduced in, you guessed it, 1875, this solid-frame 6-shot revolver was chambered in powerful cartridges like .44-40, the same round used in Winchester rifles. That gave it the same ammunition advantage as the later Remington 1890, making it especially practical for men who wanted one type of ammo for both rifle and sidearm. The 1875 quickly earned a reputation for toughness. Its solid steel frame made it incredibly durable, and many shooters considered it better built than Colt's single-action army. It also handled well with balance and accuracy that matched the Peacemaker shot for shot. Frontier lawmen, buffalo hunters, and even outlaws carried it, with Frank James famously preferring the 1875 to Colt revolvers. Side by side with the Peacemaker, the Remington 1875 had a slightly longer frame and a bit more weight in the hand. Subtle differences, but enough for shooters to notice. Some considered it sturdier, others found it slower to draw, but few could deny it was every bit Colt's equal. So why didn't it dethrone the Peacemaker? Timing and marketing. By the mid-1870s, Colt had already locked in lucrative U.S. Army contracts and dominated the civilian market. The 1875 might have been every bit as good, some would argue better, but Colt's head start ensured the Peacemaker remained the iconic revolver of the frontier. Today, the 1875 holds a special place in firearms history. Many collectors regard it as the last truly great rival to the Colt Peacemaker, and surviving examples are highly prized. It proved Colt wasn't untouchable, and for many gunfighters, it was the revolver of choice when they wanted something rugged, dependable, and just a little different from the norm. So, let me throw this one to you. If you were riding with Frank James, would you have strapped on a Remington 1875? Or would you have stuck with the tried and true Colt Peacemaker? Number 2, the Colt Cloverleaf Revolver, the 4-shooter. By the 1870s, Colt was already famous for its big 6-shooters like the Army and the Peacemaker. But tucked away in their catalog was one of the strangest and most distinctive revolvers they ever produced, the Colt Cloverleaf. This compact little pistol was part of Colt's house pistol line, and it earned its nickname from its bizarre 4-chambered cylinder that resembled the petals of a clover. Chambered in .41 rimfire, it wasn't designed for gunfighters or soldiers. Instead, it was marketed to shopkeepers, travelers, and anyone in need of a discreet self-defense weapon. Its small size and double-action trigger made it surprisingly quick to fire in close quarters, and its unusual look guaranteed it stood out from every other revolver of its time. The Cloverleaf's cylinder only held 4 rounds, but that wasn't seen as a major drawback for its intended use. In a pocket pistol meant for sudden encounters at arm's length, 4 shots were considered more than enough. Reloading was relatively fast thanks to its ejector rod system, which was ahead of many competing pocket revolvers. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The .41 rimfire cartridge was limited in stopping power, and its odd shape made it somewhat awkward to carry compared to slimmer pocket revolvers. Production numbers were relatively small, and it never reached the popularity of Colt's larger handguns. Compared to a full-size Peacemaker, the Cloverleaf looked almost like a toy, but in a crowded saloon or a dark alley, it was no toy at all. And today, because production numbers were so limited, surviving Cloverleafs are highly prized by collectors, fetching premium prices at auction. Here's the myth-busting truth. While Hollywood paints the frontier as a land where everyone carried heavy 6-shooters, many townsfolk relied on small, unusual pocket pistols like the Cloverleaf. In fact, it was one of the very first metallic cartridge revolvers Colt ever produced. A reminder that innovation sometimes came in small packages, not just in the legendary Peacemakers of dime novel fame. Number 1, the Merwin Hulbert Pocket Army, the disappearing gun. If there's one revolver that deserves the title of the rarest and strangest in the Wild West, it's the Merwin Hulbert Pocket Army. Nicknamed the disappearing gun, this revolver wasn't just unusual. It was one of the most mechanically advanced firearms of its time. First introduced in the late 1870s, the Merwin Hulbert featured a unique twist-and-pull barrel system. By rotating and sliding the barrel forward, all the spent cartridges would eject automatically while the live rounds stayed in place. This selective ejection system was unlike anything else on the market, and it allowed for lightning-fast reloads compared to traditional revolvers. Imagine facing an opponent fumbling with individual casings while you could clear and reload your gun in seconds. That was the edge the Merwin Hulbert promised. The Pocket Army model was chambered in .44-40, giving it the same ammo as Winchester rifles, and it was built with an elegant design that rivaled even the finest Colts. Outlaws, lawmen, and even military officers were known to carry them. Notorious figures like Jesse James were rumored to favor Merwin Hulberts, adding to the gun's mystique. But despite its brilliance, the revolver had one fatal flaw: timing. The company struggled financially, production numbers were low, and without major government contracts, they could never compete with Colt or Remington. As a result, relatively few were made, and fewer still survived the harsh realities of frontier life. Here's the legacy. Today, surviving Merwin Hulberts are some of the most sought-after collectibles in the firearms world. Their advanced design, rarity, and outlaw connections have made them legendary. A revolver that once slipped quietly into obscurity now commands enormous prices at auction, with pristine examples valued in the tens of thousands. In the end, the Merwin Hulbert Pocket Army wasn't just a revolver, it was a symbol of how innovation doesn't always win in its own time. But in the long run, it became one of the most iconic and fascinating forgotten guns of the Wild West. And there you have it, the 15 rarest revolvers of the Wild West. From odd four-shooters and double-trigger experiments to rugged working man's guns and the legendary disappearing Merwin Hulbert, these firearms prove the frontier was far stranger and more inventive than Hollywood ever shows. Most people picture the Wild West as a land of Colts and Peacemakers, but as you've seen today, there were dozens of unusual designs that shaped real lives on the frontier. Revolvers carried by gamblers, shopkeepers, soldiers, settlers, and outlaws alike. Some became footnotes, others became collector's treasures, but every single one tells a story about survival, innovation, and the reality of the American frontier. So which of these rare revolvers surprised you the most? Did you already know about the Merwin Hulbert? Or was the Cloverleaf or Savage Navy a total shock to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We love seeing which of these hidden gems catches you off guard. And if you enjoyed this dive into the forgotten side of the Wild West, hit that like button. It really helps keep these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the weapons, legends, and myths of the frontier, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, keep exploring, and remember, the truth about the Wild West is always stranger than the legend.
Customized. Remington new model.